St. John very succinctly defines God. He uses three simple words. God is love. God is love. So God at his core, who he is love. And Bishop Barron a couple years ago during the Year of Mercy wrote that mercy is what love looks like when it turns toward the sinner. So God in and of himself is love, and when God turns towards us, it is expressed, that love is expressed in mercy. And so this is sort of seen throughout the readings today, this idea of mercy. Not sort of, it is seen throughout the readings today. And it gives us something of a little blueprint for how we ought to live our Christian life. So we'll go a little out of order of the readings, but I think you'll see why at the end. So in the second reading, we hear from St. Paul's letter to Timothy. And Paul is recalling to Timothy about how he personally received God's mercy. He reminds Timothy that Paul was not always this wonderful evangelizer of the faith, but that he had persecuted Christians. He thought he was doing right by killing those followers of Christ, and that he personally encountered the Lord and received his mercy. He says, I was once a blasphemer, a persecutor, and arrogant, but I was treated mercifully. God treated me with love. And Paul is not just saying all the things he used to do as sort of a way to brag to his friends. Well, I used to be really, really bad. Listen to all these bad things I did. But he's sharing these with Timothy and with us who read it now to reassure Timothy, to reassure us that the Lord's mercy is great. He's basically saying, if the Lord could forgive me, who was a blasphemer and was arrogant and persecuted Christians, then the Lord can forgive you. Right? If my sins aren't too great for God's mercy, then neither are yours. In the gospel, we hear of God's mercy also. We hear these three parables. And the first two, while beautiful, I won't spend much time on, except to say that these parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin are meant to shock us. Right? When it asks that question, which one of you having 99 sheep, or which one of you having these coins and losing one, wouldn't do these ridiculous things to find them? The reaction is supposed to be, well, I wouldn't do that. If I had 99 sheep and one knucklehead went off, I probably wouldn't go search for the knucklehead, because I would leave the 99 and then they might go astray. I would send somebody else, or I would just let it go and cut my losses, right? I didn't really like that sheep anyway. Maybe the older brother will find it and that's the goat that he can have his little party with, right? But these first two are meant to shock us to see that God's mercy is not calculated. God's mercy is not limited, but it goes beyond what we think is naturally acceptable. But that third parable, right, this parable of the two sons, or as we normally say, the parable of the prodigal son, I want to focus on this a little bit. I had a new little insight into this one as I was praying with it. So I've sort of looked at all of the characters in the gospel before, but I focused this week on the Father. And I've thought about the Father before, but I never thought of him in this way. Right? The Father in the parable is meant to be God the Father, or even Christ, who is merciful. And what I thought of when I read it this week is that when we become baptized, we become other Christs. Right? That we become other Christs in the world, and so we are to imitate Christ in every way. And so the natural reaction to the first two parables is, well, me, right? I wouldn't do that. But after we're baptized, we shouldn't just have a natural reaction. We should have a supernatural reaction, because God lives in our soul. In baptism, we're raised to a supernatural life, and so we have to respond supernaturally. Right? We have to be willing to forgive the way that the Father in the parable forgives. We have to be willing to be trashed and put aside and wish that we were dead by those closest to us. And if they come back seeking mercy, we are to love them. Right? We are to show them that mercy. And again, Paul gives us the example of how we can possibly do this. Paul first encountered the mercy of the Lord, and then because of his encounter of the mercy with the mercy of God, he was then able to offer that mercy to others. And now we'll finally come to the first reading. So the first reading is from the book of Exodus, and Moses is the central figure in this reading, right? So again, all the baptized, when we are baptized, we become priest, prophet, and king. We become other Christ, and so we participate in those three roles of Christ. So we all have these roles, but some exercise a different type of priesthood, right? Those who are ordained exercise a different degree of priesthood. And so we are called to follow Christ in a very particular way through this sacrament of holy orders. And this distinction is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. Moses was not a priest of Jesus Christ, but he was a foreshadowing of this distinction. And we see this in the first reading. That as Moses is conversing with God on the mountain, the Israelites got a little restless, right? They were like scrolling on their phones and they were getting bored and they started to wander. And so they made these false gods, right? They melted down all their gold and made these calves, and they started worshiping these calves. So they turned away from the God of Israel and they turned toward false gods. This is all sin. In every sin that we commit, it's a turning away from God and turning to other things as if they were God. Right? Whatever those other things might be. And so God is talking to Moses and says, hey, your people are acting like a bunch of hooligans. I'm going to bring down my wrath upon them. But Moses, as a foreshadowing of a priest, intercedes on behalf of the people. He says, look, God, I know that they're, not the best of people, but be patient. Be merciful to them. Right? Turn your face towards them, love them, and be merciful to them. And God listens. God hears the prayer of Moses, and God is merciful. Right? This, again, is the role of the ministerial priest, of the ordained priest. That the priest is supposed to stand as a go-between between God and man, imploring God's mercy for those who have sinned. Right? Christ established the church, and he took her as his bride. Right? Christ established the church, took the church as his bride, and Christ, as the bridegroom, gave all of his power to the church, the bride. So that what Christ can do as God, the church can do in his name, because he's given that power over to her. This was in the office of readings on Friday. Blessed Isaac of Stella says this: the church is incapable of forgiving any sin without Christ, and Christ is unwilling to forgive any sin without the church. So if we are to come into contact with the mercy of God, we have to do so in and through the church. Right? That the church is the place of mercy, the place of the fullness of mercy, the place of being reconciled to God. So God is love, right? And mercy is what love looks like when it turns toward the sinner. And Pope Francis loves this idea of mercy. When you hear Pope Francis talk about mercy, you can tell that he is like St. Paul, someone who's encountered God's mercy. He didn't just read about it in a textbook in the seminary, but he's encountered the mercy of God personally. And he says that the church has to be a field hospital for sinners. Right? That the church, all of us who make up the church, have to be willing to go forth and show the mercy of God. in our role that is proper to us. And so we have to be like Paul. Right? We have to personally encounter God's mercy. We have to show the mercy of God to others as those other Christs. And we have to lead people to that sacrament of confession, right, where they encounter the mercy of the Lord in a very real, very powerful way. We receive from God's love that gift of his mercy, right? We do this never losing sight that doing so, as we heard in the gospel, doesn't just make us feel better, which it does, restores us to right relationship with God, and it causes the angels in heaven to rejoice.